Thank you, youth. Sometimes we need to see it and watch it so that we would be able to feel the emotions of the text. It's different from just reading the text, right? When you were seeing the experiences of Naomi losing her husband, her sons, those experiences that really burdened her heart, that she was able to say, don't call me Naomi, don't call me pleasant, but call me Mara because I had bitter experiences back in Moab. Now we feel the emotions. We feel the sad moments that he had gone through. And we would see what God has in store for this woman. While reading the text, I noticed in chapter 4, this is the culmination of our series. We missed this within these past 3 weeks because for some reasons that I wasn't able to continue with this. And this is what I noticed when I read chapter 4, the last chapter of the book of Ruth. I noticed that the writer took some time in explaining and showing to us what happened in the actual transaction when Boaz tried to negotiate with the closest relative, okay? So we would be reading the earlier part only of the chapter so that we would not spend the rest of our time reading the passage. We would only look at verses 1 to 12, but we will also mention later about the rest of the verses until verse 22. Ruth chapter 4, verses 1 to 12. It says here from the NASB. Now Boaz went up to the gate and sat down there. And behold, the close relative of whom Boaz spoke was passing by. So he said, "Turn aside, my friend. Sit down here." And he turned aside and sat down. He took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, "Sit down here." So they sat down. Then he said to the closest relative, "Naomi, who has come back from the land of Moab, has to sell the piece of land which belonged to our brother Elimelech. So I thought to inform you, saying, buy it before those who are sitting here and before the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if not, tell me that I may know. For there is no one but you to redeem it, and I am after you." And he said, "I will redeem it." Then Boaz said, "On the day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you must also acquire Ruth the Moabitess, the widow of the deceased, in order to raise up the name of the deceased on his inheritance." The closest relative said, "I cannot redeem it for myself, because I would jeopardize my own inheritance. Redeem it for yourself. You may have my right of redemption, for I cannot redeem it." Now this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning the redemption and exchange of land. To confirm any matter, a man removed his sandal and gave it to the other. And this was the manner of attestation in Israel. So the closest relative said to Boaz, "Buy it for yourself." And he removed his sandal. Then Boaz said to the elders and all the people, "You are witnesses today that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech, and all that belonged to Chilion and Malon. Moreover, I have acquired Ruth the Moabitess, the widow of Malon, to be my wife in order to raise up the name of the deceased on his inheritance, so that the name of the deceased will not be cut off from his brothers or from the court of his birthplace. You are witnesses today." All these people who were in the court and the elders said, "We are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, both of whom built the house of Israel. And may you achieve wealth in Ephrathah and become famous in Bethlehem. Moreover, may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, through the offspring which the Lord will give you by this young woman." May the good Lord bless the reading of His word. As I have mentioned to you, I was fascinated when I read this chapter because I noticed that the writer emphasized so much time and details in explaining about the transaction that happened. Because if you proceed to verse 13, you would see there that one verse alone summarizes that after the transaction, Boaz married Ruth, Ruth conceived a child, and the child was born. Just in one verse, those three significant events happened. But I asked the question, why did he not spend much details explaining to his readers about those three events? the wedding, the conception, and the birth. Why did he spend much time putting more details in the transaction? Probably he's trying to emphasize something in that portion of the narrative. And the answer to that is yes, he is really emphasizing something in that portion of the narrative. We call this the proportional spacing. When the writer would like to emphasize something on that particular event, he would spend much details about it because he wanted to emphasize it. Now, these are the things that I have discovered. That day, let's proceed to the third slide. That day, Boaz sat at the city gate. For what reason? Why was he there? Because he wanted to find the closest relative. I want you to remember that in the previous chapters that I have explained to you, women back then, they don't really have the right to own a property. So it's the man. However, the husband of Naomi already died, and it could be passed to his sons. But the problem is, his sons already died also. So imagine that. This woman had a piece of land, and now the harvest is over. Maybe those individuals who took care of the land when they were still in Moab should now return the land to them. Now what will she do? When she has no husband anymore and no sons to own it, she had to sell it to the closest relative. Okay? Not just to anybody, but to the closest relative. In the earlier chapter, Naomi thought of Boaz as one of the closest relatives. And so Ruth went to him and proposed to him that he would be the redeemer of the land and of the family's lineage. But they discovered something. Boaz told Ruth that I am not the closest. Somebody is closer to Elimelech than I. So you have to pass through this person. And sabi ni Boaz kay Ruth, don't worry about it, my lady. I would redeem. If this redeemer, if this closest relative would redeem, so be it. But if he will refuse, then I will take the responsibility. I'm going to redeem it. And I am putting that as an emphasis also to you this morning because I would like us to see that Boaz was willing to take a risk here. I remember a letter which I have read in an article that I forgot already what was the title of that article. But the letter went like this. This is an expression of a young man's love to a woman. And he wrote a letter to this girl. And he said in this letter saying like this, Dear Anna, you are the most adorable woman I have ever met. Your beauty is incomparable even to the most concrete representation of it. You are beautiful inside out, the humblest of all. You are indeed the most beautiful. I love you to the moon and back. I am willing to swim the Pacific Ocean just to be with you. Imagine that. I will even cross a field of fire just to have you. I will be even risking my life to get through a storm to protect you. I am willing to die for you. I love you always and forever. And you know what? Those of you who experienced sending letters before you said yours truly or your beloved or the one who loves you, there is a line that goes like this. Postscript, P.S. See you at the church if it will not rain. Love, Armando. It's kind of ironic that this guy described his love for that girl in a superlative way. Okay? Not just a comparative way, but really superlative. Because he's willing to cross even the Pacific Ocean. He loves her to the moon and back. He loves her so much. And yet at the last note of the letter, he said, see you at the church if it will not rain. That's an ironic. You love the girl so much, and then you are not even willing to take the risk of going through the rain to be with that girl. You know, you cannot love without taking a risk. That's a reality. That is why, ladies, if somebody courts you, and that person does not even take the risk of introducing you to his parents, ayaw nag-spend time with that person. Because you cannot love without taking a risk. And in this narrative, the writer put so much emphasis on that portion because he was trying to show that there were two individuals here who had the right to redeem the land, who had the right to redeem the lineage of the family. And yet, one of them was not willing to take the risk. And yet, here comes another person, another guy who was willing to take the risk. So one day, he was there at the city gate. He was already taking steps, taking risky steps. He was there at the city gate, and please flash it again. And the city gate back then was a place where you do transactions. You negotiate with people. And city gates back then was like actually a marketplace. There is a what is this? An illustration here on the screen. City gates and walls before were very thick. Okay? Maybe you're imagining about the walls, your perimeter fence at home. It's not like that, okay? Yung fence natin parang singkapal lang ng makapal lang konti sa hollow blocks eh. Kung 5 yung hollow blocks mo, may finishing both sides. Ganun lang kakapal yung wall mo. But in those days, city walls were really thick. Sometimes it would have 10 to 15 meters thickness. Very thick. And that would also tell us that the gates of those thick walls were thick also. Very thick, sometimes even thicker than the wall. So if there were about 15-meter thickness or 12-meter thickness ng walls, then the gates would be even thicker than that. Okay? So I made an illustration here. I'm not an engineer, but somehow at least I would be able to present to you in a clearer sense how thick were the walls before. And if these sides here were the walls, that thing in the middle is the gate. Underneath the gate, it's covered, of course, and both sides would have some alcoves. Are you familiar with alcoves? It's like a cubicle. Nakalinya yan. Inside the alcoves, people would make transactions. People would negotiate. Kung merong negotiation sa alcove na to, on the other side of it, some individuals were selling something. So if you think about city gates back then, it's like a marketplace actually, where there were a lot of people negotiating, transacting businesses. So that was the scenario here. And Boaz was there, seated, waiting for the closest relative to pass by. And the text tells us that he did not wait for long, because the closest relative came. He passed through the gate and Boaz called his attention. Brother, come here, and I have something to tell you. And so the transaction started. Now what happened next was really very fascinating, because when Boaz began to converse with him, he told him about the situation of Naomi and the situation of Ruth and the situation of the land, okay? And here goes the conversation. Boaz said, Naomi has to sell the piece of land which belonged to our brother Elimelech. Now, I want you to take note of this. He attributed the ownership of the land to Elimelech. Why? Because Naomi is a woman. As I have mentioned to you earlier, women will not have the authority to own such a property like that. So it was attributed to Elimelech. The land was owned by Elimelech, but it is now in the hand of Naomi. And here comes another statement. So, I thought to inform you, buy it. But if not, tell me that I may know. In other words, Boaz was telling him, Elimelech has a land, has a property, and because he passed away already and his sons already died, now Naomi is dispensing it. And she is looking for the closest relative to redeem it, to buy it. And here comes the response of the closest relative. I will redeem it. What do you think was the feeling of Boaz? Sayang. Gusto ko akong bumili. Pero marukoy po ni si Boaz. Kasi sabi niya agad, on the day you buy the field, you must also acquire Ruth. On the day you buy the field, you must also acquire Ruth in order to raise up the name of the deceased on his inheritance. Now, what was the response of the closest relative? I cannot redeem it. The big question now is, why? Earlier, when Boaz told him that there is a piece of land in the hand of Naomi that is owned by Elimelech, and now she's dispensing it. You are the closest relative who could redeem it. Will you redeem it? And he said, I will redeem it. I will buy it. And he added, if you acquire the land, you have to take Ruth with that land. So, ug sa kuan pa, murag pakapin ra ni si Ruth. Upalit kag saging na, pakapin ginamos. Oh, sige, daghan na po. But what really put a question in my mind was, kung dagdag si Ruth doon, bakit siya ngayon nag-refuse? Why this time he said, I cannot redeem it. I'm sorry. You get my authority. And in fact, he gave him his sandal to attest to those people who are surrounding them that this transaction is going to be a legal one. Boaz will have my sandal, meaning to say, Boaz will get the authority from me. And my authority now is on him. He can now buy that property. Why did he refuse when he found out that Ruth is included with the land? Because that transaction was very risky indeed. If you are the closest relative and you buy the land of a deceased person, that would entail much responsibilities. The first thing is this. If this closest relative buys the property, he will sell out a certain amount of money. Much money. It's a property. And it's in Bethlehem. So he needed to sell out money. Mababawasan na yung property niya. Second, he will become the caretaker, the protector, the provider of the family of the deceased person. Third, if this person, the lady or the woman, yung asawa ng namatay, will be able to produce a child, then the property that he bought will be reverted to the child when the child is a son. So it's very risky. For example, I am the closest relative. Here is Naomi. Naomi was old already. And in the earlier chapter, it was very clear that Naomi said, I could no longer bear a child. And even if I can bear a child, you could not wait anymore for them. That's what she told to Ruth and Orpah. But that would tell us that she was very old already. So she could no longer bear a child, right? And so now, when Boaz told the closest relative, there is a land on the hand of Naomi owned by Elimelech, will you buy it? He thought of Naomi. She's old already. She could not have a child anymore. In other words, if I buy the land will be forever mine. Okay? But when Boaz added, if you take the land, you have to take with it Ruth. And Ruth was still young. And so, if he takes the land, he buys the land, and takes Ruth within his house and become his wife, and then Ruth would bear a son, you know what happens? The property that I have paid for earlier will be reverted to the son of Ruth. And that son's name will not be under my name, but it is under the dead husband of Ruth. In other words, I pay for it, I take care of the family, and when the son comes, I would lose the property. You see, it's very risky. That is why when Boaz told him, if you take the land, you have to take Ruth with the land. And he said, I'm sorry, I'll jeopardize my property. I cannot buy that land. You redeem it yourself. In fact, Dr. Rosalita earlier said, he is also putting himself in a great position, in a bad position, in a bad condition. It's gonna ruin his life. Bakit? Ruth, as mentioned there, is a Moabitess. And as I have told you before, Israelites were told that you are not supposed to have anything to do with a Moabite. So he did not like to ruin his life. He did not like to jeopardize his property. That's why he told Boaz, it's yours. This guy wanted the land, but never wanted to take the risk. And it's a sad story if you think about it. That there are some individuals who want something, and yet in acquiring that something or that someone, they don't like to take the risk. Kaya nga sabi ko kanina, kung may nanliligaw sa'yo, tapos ayaw ka man lang puntahan sa bahay kasi takot sa parents mo, forget about that guy. He should take the risk. Take the risk. It's part of it. It's a reality that we need to face. Take the risk. And there are people who don't like to take the risk. But praise be unto God, there is somebody else in this narrative who was willing to take the risk. And that was Boaz himself. I am willing to pay for the property, and I am willing to take responsibility on the family of the deceased person. I am willing to take care of them. I am willing to provide for their needs. I am willing to become their protector. I am willing to give them shelter. And I am willing to take Ruth as my wife. And if she bears a son and I lost the property, I am willing to do that. Do we have couples here seated side by side? Please raise your hand. Couples, please raise your hand. Sabihan mo yung katabi mo, thank you for taking the risk. This guy was willing to take the risk. It was difficult. It was really very risky. You know, in an investment, the higher the risk is, the greater the possibility of return it would be. Ganun naman yun eh. But this time, the possibility of return is low, and yet the risk is very high. So this guy probably thinks like a businessman, I don't like to invest here because it's very risky, and the return is quite low. Actually, along with it is a great responsibility. I don't like to take the risk. But Boaz was willing to take the risk because he loves Ruth already, I believe. And that is why when you look at verse 13, Boaz took Ruth to be his wife. He went into her, and they bore a child, and that child was named Obed later. And fascinatingly, the text would also tell us that this boy named Obed became the person from whom David came. And then if you look at David later in the New Testament, when the Old Testament ended, it went inside the new era, the era of the New Testament, and the New Testament opens up with a book that records a genealogy, a situation, a life of a person that was born that time. And who is that person? It was Jesus Christ. So if you imagine about this, Jesus actually came from the line of David. David came from the line of Jesse. Jesse actually came from the line of Obed. Obed came from the line of Ruth. Amazing. But what's the beauty of this is that the reality, the truth of the matter, that redemption comes with a price. One will either take the risk or forget the prize. There is always a risk in love. There is always a risk in things and matters like this, in matters of life. And sometimes you are disappointed because there are people around who are not willing to take the risk. But I want you to be joyful this morning. You know, we had sad faces earlier when we were watching the young people portraying the experiences of Naomi. I can hear some of you, I know some of you were tearful already, or you were crying already during that time. The story started with a very sad scenario. Actually, for a very long time, they experienced a tragic moments in life. And yet, if you look at the end of it, you would find out that somebody cares, somebody loves, somebody who is willing to take the risk for them, just for them to be redeemed. And reality is that it was not only Naomi and Ruth who experienced this kind of love, that even you and I today are experiencing this kind of love. Why am I saying that? Look at this next slide. If you look at this person, at this figure, it is then that you would realize that there is somebody who cares for you, somebody who loves you so much, somebody who is willing to take the risk. And what did he risk here? He risked his life. And fascinatingly, when he invested his life, he was not expecting for any ROI that would be added to his being, that would be added to his condition. Why? Because Jesus Christ has everything. Jesus Christ already has his fullness inside the Trinity. There is already fullness within. He does not need anything. He does not need anybody. He does not need us. And yet he was willing to take the risk because he loves you and me. And he was willing even to risk his very own life. Redemption comes with a price. And the most expensive transaction that ever happened is on the cross at Calvary, where Jesus' blood was shed for you and for me. He loves you that much. That is why today, if you are disappointed by someone because he is not willing to take the risk, and you feel like you like to end your life, nobody loves me. He does not care for me. Look at the cross. The cross would tell you that there is a love proven already, because he did not only risk his life, he gave up his life just to have you. Look at your seatmate and tell the person, Jesus loves you. And that is the very truth that I want you to bring in your heart and mind today. You will be going out of this house of worship. You will be going back to your workplace tomorrow. You will be going back to your school tomorrow. But always remember that even if people won't appreciate you, even if people would not show their love to you, always remember that the cross of Jesus would show to us a proven love, that this person was willing to take the risk just to give you life. You are that important. If your boss would not show importance to you, if your family would not even care and show importance to you right now, if they're even putting you down, think about it. There is someone who loves you, and that love that this person has for you is more than enough to fill your heart. He took the risk. He gave up his life. That's how he loves you. And I want you to leave this building today with that gratitude in the heart, thinking always that whatever happens in life, there is Jesus who loves me, who risked his life for me. And I want you to bow down your head this morning and utter a prayer of gratitude to Jesus. Say to him, Lord, thank you very much for loving me that much. Let us bow down our heads and individually pray. Lord, how can we fathom that love that you have for us? How can a perfect God risk his very life for sinners like us? Nothing can explain that mystery. No one can understand that mystery. And you have given us a glimpse of it when we hear the word grace. We do not deserve it, and yet you have given it to us. Today, we are here in front of this communion table. We will be partaking the elements symbolizing your broken body and the blood that you have shed for all of us. The communion table will remind us not about your death, but it will remind us also, not only about your death, but it will remind also about your love. That every time we partake the bread, we are reminded that there is someone up there who loves us so much, who was willing to take the pain in his own body just to share his glory to sinners like us. And whenever we partake the cup, we are reminded that somebody out there who was willing to let his blood flow out of him, going through the excruciating pain of the nails, even of the arrow that is stabbed at your side, you were willing to take those risks and pain. And words are not enough to say thank you today, O Lord. And our act of partaking these elements would also mean we are accepting that love that you have given to us. And we are going to live our lives in gratitude to you. And we are willing to become your instrument of grace that others out there may also experience the same. And so bless our time together. Thank you for this reminder. Thank you for filling our hearts this morning. This we pray in the name of Jesus. Amen.